Here I'm standing in front of, or squatting next to, this iris species. And look, you can see this sword-like foliage coming up from the ground, which is a hallmark of many, many irises. Now, iris is a very large genus. There are a lot of different types of irises. The one that I'm in front of in particular is what they would call a tall bearded iris. For the purposes of plant identification, I would just love you to know an iris when you see it. And so here we're looking at an iris, and there's some hallmarks to the flower of an iris. Here, this part right here that hangs down, we call this the falls, and inside here is the beard, and then the standards stand up above that. Iris love to be in full sun, in most cases in full sun, in particular tall bearded iris. They're rhizominous, meaning that they spread out by rhizomes that are under the ground or slightly above the ground. And one thing that you can do to keep iris blooming well is to divide them, and that typically happens in August, but also to make sure that they're not planted too deeply. A lot of times people plant iris too deeply and they don't end up blooming. So you want to make sure that when you plant an iris, the rhizome is exposed to the top of the soil. So iris species, just I-R-I-S species. Now there are different irises with different flower forms that you'll need to be aware of. Things like Louisiana iris that has a more open bloom. There are native irises to North America. What we're looking at here, the tall bearded iris, is not a native to North America. Now irises get about especially like the tall bearded iris that we're looking at, can get upwards of 2.5 foot tall and spread out a couple feet wide. But there are miniature and dwarf versions of this as well. Typically listed as hardy from zones 5 through 9, but probably could be expanded a little bit colder under the right conditions. Not a lot of serious disease or insect problems, but there are things, iris borers, different funguses that impact the rhizomes of the iris. So here is another iris. This is like the Germanic tall bearded iris that we looked at before, but it's a smaller version of it, just about 1 foot tall, and they would consider these ones border bearded iris. They tend to bloom a little bit earlier than our bearded iris. Most irises are spring bloomers. The one I was standing by, it's actually July right now, and it is a reblooming iris. There are several reblooming irises, but typically we think around the 1st of May, around Mother's Day, as kind of high time for iris bloom. So this one, border bearded iris, just about 1 to 1.5 foot tall, a very small one. Here's a landscape tip for iris. Do well in sunny situations, locations such as borders, open woodland gardens, etc. Multiple varieties exist.